November 2022, the brutal murders of 4 University of Idaho students in their off-campus home sent shockwaves through the small town of Moscow. The gruesome crime left investigators scrambling for leads and the nation captivated by the chilling details. After weeks of mounting fear and uncertainty, the case took an unexpected turn with the arrest of Bryan Kohberger, a criminology PhD student from a nearby university. What followed was a deep dive into the mind of a suspect whose fascination with crime seemed to blur the lines between academic study and reality. This case, filled with eerie coincidences, forensic breakthroughs, and psychological intrigue, is one of the most gripping true crime stories of recent years. Let's break down the investigation, the key evidence, and the pursuit of justice that led to Kohberger's arrest.
On the morning of November 13, 2022, the quiet town of Moscow, Idaho, was shaken by a gruesome discovery. 4 University of Idaho students, Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Morgan, Shauna Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin were found brutally murdered in their off-campus home. The attack, which occurred in the early hours, left the community in shock and fear. The victims had spent the night out with friends before returning to their residence. Kaylee and Madison, who were best friends, shared a room on the 3rd floor, while Shauna and Ethan, a couple, were found on the 2nd floor. 2 other roommates, who lived on the ground floor, were unharmed and reportedly slept through the incident. Authorities described the crime scene as one of the most violent they had ever encountered. The victims had been stabbed multiple times with a large fixed-blade knife, but no murder weapon was found at the scene. There were no signs of forced entry, deepening the mystery surrounding how the attacker gained access. One chilling detail emerged from the surviving roommate's testimony. She recalled hearing crying and muffled voices. Around 4, a man described seeing a masked figure dressed in black walking through the house. Despite the terrifying encounter, she did not immediately call the police, which raised questions and scrutiny in the aftermath. The initial investigation faced significant hurdles. With no suspect identified and minimal physical evidence, the case quickly gained national attention. The university canceled classes and the community held vigils for the victims, as police urged anyone with information to come forward. Investigators began piecing together the timeline. Surveillance footage from nearby businesses showed a white Hyundai Elantra circling the area near the victim's home. This vehicle became a critical lead in the case as detectives traced its movements leading up to the murders. By December 2022, the case remained unsolved, prompting increasing public pressure and frustration. The Moscow Police Department, with support from the FBI and Idaho State Police, sifted through thousands of tips and conducted more than 300 interviews in hopes of finding the killer. A turning point came when forensic analysis linked DNA found at the crime scene to a knife sheath left on one of the victims' beds. This DNA provided investigators with their first major clue, but matching it to a suspect would take weeks of additional work. The investigation narrowed when authorities discovered that a white Hyundai Elantra registered to Bryan Kohberger, a criminology PhD student at Washington State University, matched the suspect vehicle. Kohberger lived just 10 miles from the crime scene, further tightening the circle around him. On December 30th, 2022, law enforcement arrested Bryan Kohberger at his family home in Pennsylvania. The arrest marked the end of a 6-week manhunt and the beginning of a new chapter in the investigation that would captivate the nation.
By late December 2022, the case had grown cold despite weeks of intense investigation. Surveillance footage, phone records, and forensic analysis slowly began to paint a clearer picture, but the identity of the suspect remained elusive. A crucial break came when DNA found on a knife sheath at the crime scene matched a profile linked to Bryan Kohberger. The investigation revealed Kohberger had been near the victim's home multiple times in the weeks leading up to the murders, raising suspicions of premeditation. His white Hyundai Elantra, which had been spotted on surveillance cameras the night of the killings, further cemented his connection to the crime. As detectives pieced together the evidence, they uncovered chilling details about Kohberger's obsession with criminal behavior, culminating in his arrest at his parents' home. The case was far from over, but the wheels of justice had finally begun to turn.
Following Kohberger's arrest, investigators began unraveling his background and possible motives. Kohberger, 28, was known to be highly intelligent and socially awkward. He had been pursuing a PhD in criminology and was described by classmates as intensely interested in criminal behavior. Kohberger's fascination with crime raised disturbing questions. Some speculated he may have sought to commit the perfect crime as a twisted academic experiment. Police later revealed that Kohberger had applied for an internship with a local police department, further suggesting his deep interest in law enforcement procedures. In the months leading up to the murders, Kohberger reportedly conducted online surveys, asking criminals about their thought processes during the commission of violent acts. This behavior painted a troubling portrait of someone who might have been testing his own theories in real life. The prosecution's case leaned heavily on forensic evidence. DNA from the knife sheath, surveillance footage, and cell phone records placed Kohberger near the victim's home multiple times in the weeks leading up to the attack. This pattern of stalking supported the theory that the murders were premeditated. Kohberger's trial, which began in mid-2024, became a national spectacle. The defense argued that Kohberger was being framed and claimed that the evidence against him was circumstantial. However, the prosecution countered with compelling forensic links, detailing how the DNA match and car movements aligned with the timeline of the crime. One of the most damning pieces of evidence was Kohberger's phone records, which indicated that his device had been turned off during the critical hours of the murder, but reactivated shortly afterward near his residence. This led prosecutors to argue that he deliberately disabled the phone to avoid detection. During the trial, several witnesses, including Kohberger's classmates, described his strange demeanor and obsession with crime scenes. Some testified that he often made unsettling comments about violent offenders and even discussed the Idaho murders in class, appearing to take a keen interest in the investigation. Kohberger's parents, who had supported him throughout the trial, expressed disbelief and sorrow over the charges. They maintained that Bryan had struggled socially, but could not fathom him committing such heinous acts. The emotional weight of the case left the courtroom tense throughout the proceedings. After weeks of testimony, the jury found Kohberger guilty on all counts, including 4 charges of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict brought some closure to the victims' families, though the pain of losing their loved ones lingered. The Kohberger case highlighted the evolving role of forensic technology and criminal psychology in modern investigations. It also raised awareness about the warning signs that can sometimes hide in plain sight. even among those studying the very system designed to prevent crime. As Kohberger began his life sentence, the families of Kaylee, Madison, Shauna, and Ethan continued to honor their memory through scholarships and community initiatives aimed at supporting students and victims of violence.
All right, so today we're going to dive into something really heavy, the Idaho student murders.
Yeah,
This case, I mean, it's just one of those that really gets under your skin.
it really does.
You've got 4 young people, Kaylee Goncalves,
Right.
Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin,
Yeah.
brutally murdered in their off-campus house.
Awful.
And there are 2 other roommates who survived,
Yeah.
but the whole thing is just shrouded in mystery, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, there was no forced entry.
Right.
They never found the murder weapon.
Yeah, no, that's
That's very strange.
it's just a lot of unanswered questions right from the start.
It really is a puzzle. You have this seemingly peaceful college town.
Yeah.
And then suddenly this just explosion of violence. It's like trying to fit together pieces from 2 completely different pictures.
Yeah, like a jigsaw puzzle where none of the pieces actually fit together.
Exactly.
And, you mentioned no forced entry, but then you've got this absolutely horrific crime scene with multiple stab wounds.
Like, how do those 2 things even go together?
Not at first glance, no.
Oh.
And then you factor in the fact that 2 of the roommates slept through the entire attack.
Right.
While others were murdered on different floors of the house.
Yeah, different floors.
It's strange.
It really does make you question everything, right?
Absolutely.
The killer's modus operandi, how they were able to move so undetected.
Right.
And of course, the actions of the surviving roommates as well.
For sure.
I mean, how could you sleep through that?
It's a big question.
Let's talk about those surviving roommates for a second.
Yeah.
One of them actually reported that they heard crying
Okay.
and voices around 4 a.m. and even saw a masked figure in black.
Like a
Shadow with
figure.
Yeah.
Get this.
Okay.
The police weren't called until much later. If you were in their shoes, right?
Yeah.
Hearing all of that, wouldn't you call 911 immediately? Well, it's hard to say how any of us would react in such a terrifying situation like that. But yeah, you're right. That delayed call is a massive question mark in this whole thing. It's like a piece of the puzzle that just doesn't seem to fit. What do you make of it?
Well, it's really hard to wrap my head around.
Yeah.
Maybe they were just frozen in place by sheer terror.
It's possible.
I mean, imagine coming face to face with a masked intruder in your own home, knowing that your roommates are in danger.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a level of fear
Yep.
that most of us will hopefully never, ever experience.
Absolutely.
And that brings us to the early stages of the investigation.
Right.
Can you imagine the pressure on those investigators?
Yeah. I can only imagine.
I mean, a brutal crime scene like that,
Right.
no immediate suspect,
Mm-hmm.
a town that's completely on edge,
Yeah.
and very little physical evidence to go on.
Yeah.
I mean, if you were leading that investigation, where would you even begin?
I think I would be just frantically searching for anything. Any tiny detail that could possibly be a clue.
Yeah.
It'd be like searching for a needle in a haystack.
Right.
But in this case, the haystack is a whole town full of potential leads and red herrings.
Right. And everyone is watching you,
Exactly.
waiting for answers.
Scrutinizing your every move.
Yeah.
It's high stakes.
High stakes.
Yeah.
And amidst all of that chaos, they caught a break.
Okay.
This seemingly insignificant detail, that ended up being a total game changer.
All right. I'm intrigued. What is it?
A white Hyundai Elantra,
A car.
a car.
Okay.
So this car was caught on surveillance footage
Right.
circling the area near the victim's house in the hours before the murders.
Okay.
So why do you think something like that,
Yeah.
just a car sighting, became so crucial to this investigation?
Well, in cases like this where you have so few leads to go on, even the smallest detail can become a beacon. It's something to focus on. That Elantra was like a thread that investigators could pull on, hoping that it would lead them to the bigger picture.
So they weren't just looking for any white Elantra, right?
Right.
They were looking for this specific one.
Exactly.
They had details about the model year, any visible damage, things
Right.
like that.
They had to be sure.
And it wasn't just about finding the car either, right?
No.
It was about connecting it to a person,
Correct.
to a potential suspect.
Absolutely.
It's a classic example of how seemingly random pieces of information can become the key to cracking a case wide open.
It is.
It's like those crime shows where they zoom in on a blurry reflection in a window and
Sure.
suddenly they've got their guy.
Yeah, but this car chase
Right.
went on for weeks.
It went on for weeks.
Right.
So what finally broke this case wide open
Okay.
and led them to Bryan Kohberger?
Good question.
Well, it was the silent witness that we often relied on in these situations.
Right.
DNA.
Oh, wow.
They found a knife sheath at the crime scene,
Okay.
and on that sheath, they found DNA.
So they had the killer's DNA.
Yeah.
I mean, that's huge, right?
It is huge.
Like, you can't argue with that kind of evidence.
Right. But how did they actually match that DNA to Kohberger?
Okay.
Was it in a database or something?
That's where the science gets really interesting. It's not just about finding the DNA. It's about analyzing it and comparing it to potential suspects.
Okay.
And in this case, that analysis led them to Bryan Kohberger,
Okay.
a PhD student in criminology,
Hold on. A criminology student?
living just 10 miles from the victim's house.
That's kind of creepy, isn't it?
It's a little.
I mean, you'd think someone studying crime would be the last person to commit one.
You would think so, yeah.
What are the odds?
It's definitely a twist that raises a lot of questions, doesn't it? Here's someone who is deeply immersed in the world of criminal behavior.
Yeah.
And suddenly, he becomes the prime suspect
Yeah.
in a brutal murder case.
Yeah.
It's like something out of a psychological thriller.
It really is. So Kohberger is arrested at his family home in Pennsylvania 6 weeks after the murders.
Yeah.
So what kind of picture started to emerge about him at that point?
Well, the portrait that started to come together was a complex one. He was described as highly intelligent, but also socially awkward.
Mm.
And he had this intense interest in criminal behavior,
Okay.
to the point where he even applied for an internship with the local police department.
Okay, now that sends chills down my spine.
Yeah.
A criminology student who wants to work with the police. It's almost like he was trying to get an inside look at how investigations work.
Yeah. I mean, it's not unheard of for criminology students to do that, but in light of everything else, it definitely adds another layer to the mystery.
Another layer.
Yeah, and it gets even weirder. In the months leading up to the murders, Kohberger was conducting online surveys about the thought processes of criminals, specifically those who commit violent acts.
So he was basically asking criminals how they did it,
Yeah.
what was going on in their minds.
Exactly.
That's disturbing on so many levels.
It is.
I mean, was he just a curious student? Or was there something else going on there?
That's a question that investigators were grappling with as well.
Yeah.
Were these surveys simply a way for him to delve deeper into the academic study of criminal minds?
Right.
Or was it something more sinister, like a way to research and maybe even plan his own crimes?
And if he was planning something,
Yeah,
wouldn't that be incredibly risky?
you would think.
I mean, leaving a digital trail like that.
You would think so, wouldn't you? But remember, we're dealing with someone who is studying criminal behavior.
Right.
Maybe he thought he was smart enough to cover his tracks. Or maybe he simply underestimated the power of digital forensics.
Yeah, it's, this is where things start to feel like a true crime documentary, right?
It is.
We've got this young man seemingly obsessed with crime. He's living just miles from the victims. His DNA is at the scene. It's all starting to add up in a very unsettling way.
You're right. The pieces are starting to fall into place.
Yeah.
And as the investigation progressed, the evidence against Kohberger just kept mounting, leading to a trial that captivated the entire nation.
Wow.
Everyone wanted to know, was this brilliant criminology student a cold-blooded killer? And if so, why?
Okay, so the stage is set for the trial. This is where the rubber really meets the road. But with so much evidence pointing towards Kohberger,
Right.
what was the defense's strategy? I mean, they couldn't just ignore all of this, could they?
Well, their main argument was that Kohberger was being framed. They claimed that the evidence was circumstantial and pointed to the lack of a clear motive, but the prosecution had a mountain of forensic data to counter that argument. They meticulously laid out the DNA match, the surveillance footage placing Kohberger's car near the crime scene, and a crucial piece of evidence, his cell phone records.
Cell phone records.
Yeah.
What do those have to do with anything? I mean, everyone has a cell phone.
True, but these records showed that Kohberger's phone was turned off during the crucial hours of the murders, but then reactivated shortly afterward near his own residence.
Really?
Yeah, the prosecution argued that this was a deliberate attempt to avoid detection, a sign of guilt.
What do you think about that? Could that be interpreted in any other way?
I mean, it definitely seems suspicious, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like, why would you turn off your phone during that specific time frame? Unless you have something to hide.
Exactly.
And it wasn't just the cell phone records either.
Yeah.
The prosecution also called on people who knew Kohberger. And their testimonies painted a pretty unsettling picture. They described his strange behavior, his fascination with crime scenes, and even recalled him making some pretty disturbing comments about violent offenders.
Wait, so he was actually talking about this stuff with other people?
Yeah.
What kinds of things was he saying?
Some witnesses mentioned that he would make offhand remarks about violent crimes, almost like he was detached from the reality of it all.
Oh.
And get this, some of his classmates even remembered him discussing the Idaho murders in class, seemingly fixated on the detail.
In class.
Yeah.
So not only was there physical evidence like the DNA and the cell phone records, but there were also people who personally knew him and had noticed these red flags in his behavior.
Right.
It's like the prosecution was building a case from every possible angle.
They were. It was a multi-layered case built on forensic science, digital footprints, and personal testimonies. And all of it pointed in one direction, towards Bryan Kohberger.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's almost like they were creating this web around him,
Right.
slowly ensnaring him with each piece of evidence.
Yeah.
But, it makes you wonder what was going through Kohberger's mind during all this.
Right.
What about his family?
Yeah.
How are they reacting to these accusations against their son?
Well, that's a really good question. And you can only imagine the turmoil they must have been going through. His parents actually stood by him throughout the trial, maintaining his innocence.
Wow.
Yeah, they said that, while he might have been socially awkward, he was absolutely incapable of the kind of violence he was being accused of.
I can only imagine how difficult that must have been for them. To believe in your child's innocence when the evidence seems so stacked against them, it's a parent's worst nightmare.
It is.
Did the families of the victims ever speak publicly about the case?
Yes, they did. And their words were incredibly powerful. During the sentencing phase, they gave victim impact statements that just ripped your heart out.
Yeah.
They talked about the immense void left in their lives, the constant struggle to cope with the loss of their children.
It's a stark reminder that behind all the legal arguments and the forensic evidence, there are real people whose lives have been shattered by this.
Absolutely.
Did the trial bring them any sense of closure or justice?
It's hard to say. I think for them it was about holding the person responsible accountable for their actions, making sure that Kaylee, Madison, Xana, and Ethan's memories were honored. The trial couldn't bring their loved ones back, but it was a step towards healing, towards ensuring that something like this never happens again.
Yeah, towards some kind of resolution at least.
Yeah.
So after weeks of testimony, mountains of evidence, and those emotional pleas from both sides, the jury finally reached a verdict. I can only imagine the tension in that courtroom.
Oh, I bet.
What was it?
Guilty on all counts. 4 charges of first-degree murder.
Wow.
And it was a unanimous decision from the jury, which is a pretty clear indication that they found the evidence against Kohberger overwhelming.
Yeah, guilty on all charges. That must have been a heavy moment for everyone involved.
It was.
What was Kohberger's reaction when the verdict was read? Did he show any remorse or emotion?
Reports from the courtroom described him as showing very little emotion.
Really?
Yeah, it was almost as if he was detached from the gravity of the situation, resigned to his fate.
That's chilling. It makes you wonder what was going on in his mind at that moment. Did the victims' families find any solace in the verdict?
I think for them it was a bittersweet victory. It provided some sense of closure, knowing that the justice system had worked, that the person responsible for taking their loved ones away would be held accountable. But it couldn't bring back their children. Their pain was still raw, still palpable. No verdict could truly erase that.
No, of course not. It's a reminder that justice, while necessary, can't fully heal the wounds left behind by such a horrific crime.
That's true.
So what happened next? What was Kohberger's sentence?
He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge, in handing down the sentence, talked about the sheer brutality of the crimes, the lasting impact it had on the victims' families, and the need to protect society from someone capable of such violence.
Yeah, life in prison without parole. It's the harshest punishment possible, isn't it?
It is.
It feels like a fitting end to this dark chapter. But what about the ripple effects?
Right.
I mean, how did this case impact the community of Moscow, Idaho?
Well, it shook them to their core. Moscow is a small college town, a place where people felt safe, where things like this just didn't happen.
Right.
This case shattered that sense of security. It forced people to confront the reality that evil can lurk anywhere, even in the most idyllic of settings.
And it wasn't just a local story, was it?
No.
I mean, the Idaho student murders captivated the entire nation.
They did.
Do you think it changed the way we think about crime, about safety, about the role of technology in investigations?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
This case really put a spotlight on the power of forensic technology. The use of DNA evidence, surveillance footage, cell phone data, it was all crucial in building the case against Kohberger. It showed how even the smallest digital footprint can tell a story, can lead to justice.
It's like a real-life CSI episode, isn't it?
It is.
Every text message, every Google search, every location ping, it's all potential evidence.
It is.
Do you think this case will change the way investigators approach these types of crimes in the future?
I think it already has. Law enforcement is increasingly relying on digital forensics to solve crimes. This case showed just how effective those tools can be, and it's only going to become more important as technology continues to evolve.
So in a way, Kohberger's own fascination with technology, with the digital world, may have ultimately contributed to his downfall. It's a strange kind of irony, isn't it?
It is.
But this case also sparked a debate about something else, criminal profiling.
Oh, right.
What are your thoughts on that?
It's a complex issue, and this case definitely brought it to the forefront. The idea that certain personality traits and behaviors can be used to identify potential offenders. Some experts argued that Kohberger fit a certain profile, while others cautioned against making generalizations and relying too heavily on these types of profiles.
Right, especially considering Kohberger himself was studying criminology.
Exactly.
I mean, was he trying to use his knowledge of criminal profiling to avoid detection?
That's possible.
Or did his studies in a way make him more susceptible to leaving behind those behavioral clues that investigators are looking for?
It's a fascinating question, isn't it? Did his deep dive into the criminal mind give him a false sense of confidence? Or did it ultimately betray him by making him more aware of the very patterns he was trying to avoid? I think it speaks to the inherent tension between the academic study of crime and the reality of criminal behavior.
Yeah, that's such an interesting point. It's like he was studying the game while playing it, but maybe he forgot that there are real consequences, real victims in this game.
Exactly. And it raises an even bigger question. Can someone be so close to the subject matter, so deeply immersed in the world of crime, and still become a perpetrator themselves?
That's a question that a lot of people were asking after this case, wasn't it?
It was.
It's a chilling thought that the very people studying crime could also be capable of committing it.
It is. It challenges our assumptions about who criminals are, where evil comes from. We like to think that there's a clear distinction between those who study crime and those who commit it, but the reality is far more complex. And I think that's what makes this case so disturbing, so thought-provoking.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it really makes you question everything you thought you knew about human nature.
It does.
But let's shift gears for a moment and talk about the victims' families.
Right.
How are they coping with this unimaginable loss?
Well, it's been incredibly difficult for them, as you can imagine, but they've shown remarkable strength and resilience. They've channeled their grief into honoring their loved ones' memories, establishing scholarships, working with organizations dedicated to supporting victims of violence.
That's amazing. Turning their pain into something positive, something that can help others. It's a testament to the power of the human spirit to find light in the darkest of times.
It is.
But I keep coming back to Kohberger and his studies.
Yeah.
Do you think there's any way to prevent future tragedies like this, especially when it comes to people studying criminal behavior?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
There are no easy answers. But I do think this case highlights the importance of recognizing warning signs, of being attuned to those who exhibit a fascination with violence. That goes beyond simple academic curiosity.
So what should we be looking for?
Right.
What are the red flags?
Well, it's not always easy to spot, but there are often subtle clues: a preoccupation with violent imagery, a lack of empathy, a tendency to isolate oneself, and as we saw with Kohberger, an unsettling interest in the details of real-life crimes.
Right. It's almost like trying to solve a puzzle, piecing together those fragments of behavior to see if they form a larger, more disturbing picture.
Exactly. And it's not about labeling everyone who shows an interest in crime as a potential threat. It's about being aware, being observant, and trusting our instincts when something feels off.
Yeah, trusting your gut.
Right.
It's about seeing the human being behind the academic subject, recognizing that knowledge without empathy can be a dangerous thing.
It can be.
So in a way, this case reminds us that we all have a role to play in preventing violence, right?
We did.
It's not just the job of law enforcement, it's a collective responsibility.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
We need to be vigilant, we need to be informed, and we need to be willing to speak up when we see something that concerns us.
Yeah, speak up.
Absolutely.
It's about fostering a culture where people feel comfortable sharing their concerns, knowing that they'll be taken seriously.
Exactly. Early intervention can make a world of difference. It's about creating a safety net, not just for potential victims, but for those who might be struggling with dark thoughts, who might be on a path that leads to violence.
Yeah, support system for everyone.
Yeah.
Well, this has been a truly intense deep dive, hasn't it?
It has.
Full of twists and turns, darkness and glimmers of hope.
Right.
We've covered a lot of ground. From the chilling details of the crime scene, to the complex world of forensic science, from the psychology of the accused, to the enduring strength of the victims' families. What stands out to you the most about this case?
That's a good question. For me, it's the stark reminder that the line between studying crime and committing it can be blurry.
Yeah.
It's a chilling thought, but it's a reality we need to acknowledge. It's about recognizing that knowledge without empathy, without a moral compass, can be a dangerous tool.
And that's a powerful message to leave our listeners with. The Idaho student murders were a tragedy that shook a nation, but they also serve as a stark reminder of our shared humanity, the importance of vigilance, and the power of community in the face of unimaginable darkness. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.